we are ready for Joshua chapter 11 in our study. Let's begin first by noticing where we have been, a review of the chapters where we've been in the first 10 chapters of Joshua. Chapter 1 was about Joshua prepares for the conquest. Chapter 2, the spies were sent to Jericho. That's where they made a deal with Rahab the harlot. Chapter 3 had the crossing of the Jordan. Chapter 4 dealt with the memorial stones that were to be set up in two places once they crossed. The 5th chapter dealt with the second generation being circumcised, suggesting to us there had been neglect in the wilderness of that very principle. And then we have the first of the conquest. We have the taking of Jericho. And then in chapter 7, there was an attempt at Ai that was failed because of Achan's sin. Chapter 8, they were successful at Ai because they did it the right way. And then we have the treaty with the Gibeonites. They'll be mentioned in our study tonight. And then chapter 10 dealt with the conquest of the south. And we're going to talk about the central campaign, the southern campaign, and the northern campaign, and finish the northern campaign in our study tonight. Here is our outline of the book of Joshua as per Wiersbe. Deals with three matters: the crossing of the river, and we are in the section, chapter 6 through 12, which we'll finish next week, the conquering of the enemy. Chapter 12 basically is going to be a listing of the kings that were conquered and how many kings were conquered. We'll deal with all of that next week. That's basically what chapter 12 is about. So other than that, when we get through tonight, we're through with the conquest, and we're through with the conquering of the enemy. Chapters 13, which we'll get into next week, through 24, deals with the claiming of the inheritance. So we're ready now for the northern campaign. We've dealt with the central campaign, the southern campaign, and ready for the northern campaign. So chapter 11, we simply call the conquest of the north. And that's what this deals with. Just for reference, as we have mentioned in the study last time, this is basically the land that was taken, and that'll be mapped out for us a little bit later in our study. But this is the method. There were three basic campaigns. And there was the central campaign, and that was involving Jericho and Ai, the treaty with the Gibeonites. Then there was the southern campaign, and that we dealt with that in our study last week. It was a little more, not as detailed as we had in chapter 6 or 7 and 8. But basically, here's what happened to those kings to the south. So you had the southern campaign. So they kind of divided the nation up, the country up, and what we're dealing with tonight is the northern campaign. Now, I'm going to get ahead of myself, and we'll draw attention to this a little bit later. Let's go to the very end verse. And the text says, "Then the land rested from war." So when we get through tonight, the point is that they rested from war and the conquest is over, basically. But let's jump ahead now to chapter 13. Chapter 13 in verse 1, "Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, 'You are old, advanced in years, and there remains very much land yet to be possessed.'" But I thought the conquest was over. And it says it's over, basically, because there was rest from war. And then when we get to chapter 13, there's more conquered yet. And so how do you harmonize that? Well, I think what's going on here is that when they are involved in these three major campaigns, they're taking fortified cities, major cities. There are still places wherein they're not capturing everyone nor killing everyone, but as they settle into the land, that's what they're supposed to be doing. So they basically have control of the land, so that there is no king, there is no group, there is no band of kings can band together to fight them and drive them out of the country. They basically have control of the land, both in the central and the southern and the northern part. And now they divide it up beginning in chapter 13, and as this tribe takes this area and this tribe takes that area, they're to drive out the inhabitants and clean up that area. So there's more to be done, more possession to take, but they basically have conquered the land. So that's the harmony, I think, of chapter 11 and chapter 13, and we'll say more about that when we get to chapter 13. So let's go back to our outline here. Chapter 11, our first question for tonight is a short summary of chapter 11. Basically, it's the conquest of the north. So three things are going to happen here. The northern kings come to battle with Israel. They've heard about what's happened in the central campaign and in the southern campaign. So they band together, form a coalition, become quite careless. We'll talk about it a little bit later. And they're ready to have the battle they think. They're plenty of numbers. And then Israel's going to have victory over all the northern kings. Then when we come to 16 to 23, we have the land that Joshua conquered, the territory that is taken. The war was a long war. We'll talk about how long it was, not mentioned here, but we deduce that a little bit later in the book. What was accomplished there that was really a threat to them. We'll see all of that in the latter part of the chapter. So let's talk about the northern kings come to battle with Israel, verses 1 to 5. The northern kings. Now, in order to do that, let's take just a moment and jump over to a map and map these out as we go. And so let's start with verse 1. That Jabin, king of Hazor. This is our map of Palestine. Let's find Hazor, circled right there. Hazor is just north of the Sea of Galilee. That's where Hazor is. Now, as we mentioned earlier, we think in our day and time of a king, being a king of a whole nation or a whole realm, these were cities that were fortified, and there were kings of cities. Like Jerusalem had a king of Salem, that we often talk about. That was Jerusalem. But anyway, king of Hazor, heard about these things, that is what in the central and the southern campaign, and he sent to Jobad, the king of Madon. And so he gets with the king of Madon, and they agree together. And the king of Shimron, here is Shimron, and to the king of Akshaph, which is right on the seacoast over there. And then we go to verse 2, and to the kings that were in the north, in the mountains of the plains of Chinnereth, and the lowland and the heights of Dor to the west. And so here are all these kings in the north. That's all I'm wanting you to see, not necessarily remember where every one of these are. But then there is a band of people or tribe of people that are mentioned at verse 11, tribes. There's the Canaanites, you see it underlined, in the east, and the Amorites and the Hittites, and I don't have the rest of these listed here. We'll talk about them a little more later, and the Perizzites and Jebusites. So in other words, all these people of the land, basically what was left in the north, in these major fortified cities, and then the people of the Canaanites and Amorites, they all band together, and they have a large group, a large army, a large force, and something they think has to be done indeed with Israel. Now verse 3 mentions, verse 4, they went out with their armies to battle with many, here's what I want us to see, the many horses and chariots. And we're going to say more a little bit later about the confidence that they had, the overconfidence they had, perhaps because of the large numbers. They're overconfident and they become careless, because we're going to see catching them by surprise in his attack upon them. So they must have been careless, thinking their numbers, because we are great in number, therefore we surely can this army of the Jews. Now at verse 5, then all the kings met together and came encamped at the waters of Merom, and that's there in the rectangle just put up, to fight against Israel. So that's what we saw in verses 1 to 5. So what we've accomplished here is, here's all these kings. How many are going to be identified more in chapter 12? We'll save that number a little bit later, or at least a summary of that. So here's all these kings of the north. They've band together. They have a coalition, and they've unified, and they think indeed they've got this under their belt. Now, we'll come back to that map a little bit later. I want us to go back to our outline here, beginning at 6. It talks about a battle taking place at Merom, and a battle at Hazor, and then how Joshua conducted the battle. So let's see what happened in this battle. Basically, this is a battle that went on for some time, that took a while to accomplish all that. Now, beginning at verse 6, the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid." You might underline that. He's going in with an army larger than the army that he has. Perhaps this is the largest army he's faced thus far, because it wasn't that large of an army that he faced when he went to Jericho or at Ai, nor really that large of an army. There's no reference that I remember about that large of an army, though it was a larger army than what he had at Jericho or Ai that he would face going to the south. But this is a very large army, according to verse 6. Verse 4, rather. It was very many horses, but I missed this point at verse 4, that their armies were as many as people as the sand that was on the seashore in multitude. That's not a literal statement, but it's just saying too numerable to count. That's the idea. That here is an army that's too numerable to count. It's not like there's 2,000 troops or 1,000 troops or 5,000 or whatever that's fighting against them, but it's too numerable to count, as the sand on the seashore is the idea, and they have many horses and many footmen that are involved in many chariots. Now let's go back to verse 6. The Lord said in the middle of that, do not be afraid because of them. Now there's something to practical. If we're looking for an answer to question number 10, list practical lessons that you've learned. We'll answer this a little bit later, give this a little bit later, but one of the basic things is don't be afraid when things look out of hand. Don't be afraid when it looks like you're being outnumbered. Don't be afraid when you think the enemy has an advantage over you. Don't be afraid when you think that you don't have the forces to fight the battle that's ahead. And on we could go with all of that. Don't be afraid. Now, why not be afraid? Grady Dages, I think you've got a question about this. Why was Joshua told not to be afraid? Well, here it is. For tomorrow about this time, I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. It doesn't matter how big the army is, doesn't matter how great it is, how many there are, how many horses there are. I'm going to deliver them all slain before you. And well, that's exactly what God had said about Ai the second time, Jericho the first time, which was the only time of Jericho. God said, I've given it into your hand. He said, Ai the second time, not the first time, but the second time I've given it into your hand. And then the battle to the south, God said, I've given it to your hand. So when God gives assurance, God keeps his promise. We'll say more about that. That's another practical thing we learned from that. But God said, I'm going to deliver them. That's why I've given you my promise. And when God's given a promise, we have no reason for fear. So if God's given you some assurance, something on a peg you can hold on to, we have no reason to fear at all. Another practical thing. Now here's what you're going to do. You're going to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. Now horses, we don't normally think of that being a great, in our day and time at least, that's not a great tool for battle. I want to know how many planes they've got, how many bombs they've got, how many weapons they've got, what size weapons an army's got, if we're going to be able to take that. But the horses was like having the number of planes. That's their means of getting in quick to the battle. Chariots were essential to a successful large army. And to hamstring the horses, in other words, to cut part of the leg or the muscle of the leg, so you keep the horse for good, basically. He's worthless. Might as well be shot. He can't be used again. And burn the chariots, you basically... to put it in language of our day and time, you've taken all their planes out, and you've taken all their ships out, and you've taken all their ammunition away. You've basically destroyed the army. You're going to do that as you slay them. Now, at verse 7, we're still in the battle at Merom, that Joshua and all the people of war came against them suddenly by the waters of Merom, and they attacked them. Now, that gives me the idea of a surprise attack. Cook observed in his commentary on Joshua, says, taken by surprise and him between the mountains and the lake, the chariots and the horses had no time to be deployed and no room to act effectively. And then in all probability, the host of the coalition fell into hopeless confusion. Pretty good commentary on what must have happened. That no matter how many of the horses they have, if they're not saddled up and ready to go, and they're not harnessed up for the chariots, and the chariots are not hooked up, they're of no use. They catch them by surprise and quickly then dismantle their horses and burn their chariots. They're done and they're finished, and nothing can be done. Now at verse 8, I just want you to notice that surprise attack. That was a means of the attack. Verse 8 now, the Lord delivered them into their hand, so they defeated them and chased them to the greater Sidon and to the brook of Misrephoth, to the valley of Mizpah eastward, and they attacked them till they left none of them remaining. Now let's stop there and get some things on the map. Now, This battle that took place, what I'm wanting you to see, if I can find it right here, is this the map I'm looking for? Yes. This is from Logos Bible software, not quite as easily read as other maps. But here's where the battle started, right here at Mimron, and there's going to be another battle over here at Hazor. But as they begin to drive them away, this large number, they caught them by surprise. Where he's saying that they drove them is up as far as Sidon. I mean, that's a pretty good ways they drove the army away. They just kept fleeing and running from them. So the only hope they had, the enemy had of escaping was to run and to flee from them, and they tried their best and could not do that. Now let's drop down to into verse 8. They attacked them and left none of them remaining. In other words, it was an utter slaughter. Verse 9. Joshua then did to them as the Lord had commanded him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. So there's no way that they can reassemble an army, and so they were defeated. A large portion of the army, there's perhaps some that they didn't bring to that army, as we're going to see at Hazor here in just a moment. Hazor is going to be identified as an original camp for them. All right, let's go back to our outline and go from there. Let's go back now to verse 10 through 12. Beginning at verse 10 now. What we have at verse 10 is the battle at Hazor. Now, we've already mentioned Hazor. Hazor is right here. And just above, or just to the west of it, is the first battle took place. So here's what well, there is a battle taking place right here at, let's put that back up, at Hazor. Let's see what happens at 10 to 12. Then Joshua turned back, and he took Hazor and struck its king with a sword. Again, this is a fortified city with its own king. And for Hazor had formerly been the head of all these kingdoms. Now, what I take that to be is that this was not necessarily the camp. They had all assembled together over at Merom, but Hazor had been a what's the wording here? I've lost my wording here. The head of those kingdoms. Apparently, as they had formed coalitions in the past for some reason, this is where I don't know that was just a recent headship. It may have been, but this was a place where basically they had formed the seat of working the governments together. There seems to be a home base there, is what I'm taking that to be, is why Joshua goes back. So now verse 11, he struck all the people with the sword, with the edge of the sword, and utterly destroying them, and left none of them breathing, and then burned Hazor with fire. Grady Dages, you've got a question. What city was burned? There is your city right there. So he burned that city with fire, the text says. So he utterly destroyed it. Now, the rest of the cities, we're going to see in a moment, he didn't burn. Why? Because they are to be taken as booty. They're able to take that and use that for themselves, which they were allowed to do the second time at Ai, but not at Jericho. Now, verse 12, to finish that section, then all the cities of those kings and all their kings, Joshua struck with the sword, and he utterly destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Now let's get a reference in the old, back in the Pentateuch about that. Let's turn to Numbers 33, if you will. And you might have a marginal note. By marginal note, in the center reference column, you might underline that, circle that. Sometimes those are good references. Sometimes they're not accurate. This one does seem an accurate reference back to where Moses had done that. So I don't think that verse 12 of our text is saying Moses had directly told Joshua, this is what you're going to do when you get over there. But in the directions that Moses left in his writings, that this is exactly what God had commanded through Moses. So let's go back to verses 50 to 56 and Numbers 33. We won't read all of that. Speak to the children of Israel, starting at verse 51, that when you crossed over Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, destroy their engraved stones, and destroy their molten images, etc. Verse 53, you shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land, and that I've given you to possess. Verse 55, but if you do not drive out the inhabitants, then there'll be irritants to your eyes and thorns to your side. I'm just paraphrasing and getting the highlights of that. But Numbers 33, 50 to 56, Moses had said, drive out everybody, and if you don't drive them out, they're going to be a thorn in your side. Well, let's footnote here now. They didn't do that. They've conquered the land in the sense, and Joshua's commendation tonight is he did exactly everything God told him to do. But when they settle into the land later, and I'm getting ahead of myself, not tonight's lesson or even next week's lesson, but on into the days of the prophets, they didn't drive out the people like they should have. They didn't do what Numbers 33 said. But at this point, they are doing that. That's the point we want to see. All right. Now that gets us through verse 12. So there's been two battles. There's been a battle at Merom and at Hazor. And Hazor was burned, but the battle's not completely over. Now here's how Joshua conducted the battle, 13 to 15. We're going to get some more practical stuff here at verse 15. So let's see what happens in 13 to 15. Then we stop for any catching up on our questions here. Verse 13, but as for the cities that stood on their mounds, that would be a city that's built as a city would be destroyed from previous battles, and you built on top of it, and then that wouldn't be destroyed, and then you build on top of that, and then you build on top of that, and you build on top of that, and that forms a mound. But as for the cities that stood on their mounds, Israel burned none of them except Hazor, only which Joshua burned. Graded Ages, you've got a question on that. How many other cities were burned? None of the other cities. But that one they did. Verse 14, that all the spoil, here's what I mentioned just a moment ago, that they were able to take all the spoils and the livestock Israel took as booty for themselves, and they struck every man with a sword until they destroyed them and left none of them breathing. So there's utter destruction in this battle that's going on now at Merom and at Hazor. Now verse 15. This is more about how Joshua conducted the battle. And the Lord commanded, as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. 2 or 3 practical things in that. One, I'm learning something about careful obedience to the Lord. That it wasn't that Moses gave some direction and Joshua did most of that. In fact, he did 99% of that. If he did more of what God said than disobeying God. That's not what he said. The text says, so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Could that be said of me? Could that be said of you? Of what the Lord said, I left nothing undone. It's not talking about flawlessness and perfection. It's talking about just doing what the Lord said. I've left nothing undone. Have you left nothing undone? Is that the idea? Could that be said of me? Could it be said of you? Careful obedience. Here's a second lesson. Closely connected with that. You might underline that phrase, so Joshua did. What does that mean? As he was commanded, so he did. I can't read that without thinking of Genesis 6 and in verse 22. This is one of my favorite phrases in the story of the flood. God had given instructions to Moses for building the ark, and it says, thus Noah did according to all that God commanded. And here's 3 words, so he did. Could that be said of me? Could that be said of you? That as God commanded us, so we did. Could that be written on your tombstone? Of all that the Lord said, he did, or so she did. The kind of instructions God gave of being a father and being a husband, so he did. Kind of instructions of being a mother and being a wife, so she did. Being the faithful, diligent Christian, so he did, so she did. And on we go. Here's another lesson I learned from verse 15. Looking for something practical at question number 10. And I learned something very practical about when something has been uttered that came from God, though it's uttered by one person and handed down to even to another person, it's just as binding as if God said it.